Our speaker today is Alberto Ghibellini, famous Italian name, with a somewhat partisan tilt. Whatever he says will probably be said in support of the emperor. And we're looking for a representative of the Guelph Party to come next year to stand up for the Pope. Alberto Ghibellini is a professor of law and political thought at the University of Torino. He's the author of a book in Italian, Al di là della politica. What is al di là? Is beyond or beyond politics. Yeah, Filosofia, retorica. And he's taught in America at MIT and lectured at Harvard and Chicago, UMass Boston, Boston College, and many other places. And he's a winemaker, a vintner of an excellent wine called La Ghibellina. So you see the connection between the wine and the name. Very, very similar they are. And this is in Gavi, which is a small section, wine section in the province of Piedmont, in the country called Italy. He's going to talk about his latest book, which is called Leo Strauss and the Recovery of Natural Philosophizing. So, Alberto.
Thank you very much, Harvey. Thank you all for coming. If I had known that you would introduce me so well, and not only as far as my studies, but also as far as my wine making, my winery, I would have brought perhaps a couple of bottles to share. During the...
You can mail them.
Okay. Thanks a lot. And perhaps some Guelph will turn up to be in the room, and we'll discover this later on. We'll see.
A secret emissary.
Exactly. So I'm going to talk about my most recent book, Leo Strauss and the Recovery of Natural Philosophizing, recently published by State of New York University Press. It is a book which is the end result of a kind of long process. Everything started around 10 years ago at the Leo Strauss Center at the University of Chicago, where I was a visiting scholar. And I was there to develop a research project whose title was Leo Strauss on Natural Right. So as you can now see, the title and the topic of the research has broadened, and it has shifted from right, more specifically, to philosophizing. What has remained constant is the reference to nature. You can see the adjective natural in both titles, and of course, the author at the center of my research, Leo Strauss. So I'll tell you soon why nature is so important, so as to remain constant in the reference. But first let me explain why I thought that a broadening of the topic was important in general, but also to understand the natural right, which was the subject of my research back then. Well, the reason is that Strauss's approach to natural right, as those familiar with him know, is not a historical one, is not an antiquarian one. So even though it is not clear to understand, to begin with, what Strauss regarded as natural right, except perhaps that he didn't agree with the modern view of natural right as a subjective claim. He was rather trying to recover, so to say, a more objective view. according to which natural right means what is by nature right. Well, his perspective as this attempt to recover a sort of objective view of natural right already tells can be regarded, at least this was my understanding, as a genuinely philosophical one. So not a historical, antiquarian one, but a genuinely philosophical one. And it is important to emphasize that a genuinely philosophical perspective, according to Strauss, should be understood in the sense of a philosophy that at least aims to achieve a stable, I would say, a historical truth about natural right, about any other topic. So a philosophy which it goes beyond, I would say, the typical understanding of positivism, so philosophy as methodology, or philosophy as self-understanding of a historically conditioned culture as it is understood by historicism. So if this is the case, and I think that there is enough evidence to show that this is the case in Strauss, we need to raise a preliminary question, which is the question of the meaning, I would say, of the foundation of this more genuine philosophical approach, as well as, I would say, how we can recover that approach. At least these seems to be Strauss's main objectives. So when it comes to the first question, what is the foundation of that more genuinely philosophical approach? This is precisely where nature becomes fundamental. This is at least my understanding, because I believe that Strauss is very clear and straightforward regarding the fact that there is a close link between philosophy, genuine philosophy on the one hand, and nature, the concept of nature on the other. So much so, I think that you cannot have the one without the other. So genuine philosophy or philosophizing, according to Strauss, means a philosophizing that has at its basis this concept of nature. Okay, so this is something I believe can be safely said, relying on his writing. So the question arises as to what nature means in Strauss's view. And this question is the question I mostly addressed in the introduction of this book. And there I try to show that even though there are various meanings of nature in Strauss and in his writing spanning from matter, like the first principles investigated by materialist physics, to, for instance, what antedates any education in human beings, like according to Hobbes in Strauss's understanding, meaning in Hobbes the passions. Well, I believe that in Strauss one can see, at least I claim in the book, in the introduction in particular, but throughout the book, that one can see in Strauss a higher view and concept of nature. And in this sense, nature means a standard. And more specifically, it means the essence or the idea that can be grasped by means of Socratic dialectics. So starting from the opinions, and by means of dialectics, humans can reach that goal. And Strauss, in this context, refers to Socrates' second sailing, so in the Phaedo. So the attempt of Socrates to investigate this essence by turning to the logoi, rather than following the example of Anaxagora in trying to directly grasp the principles. So this is the understanding I was able to trace. This said, and even though in some of the letters, in particular from the 30s, he seems to have a rather metaphysical approach to some extent. If not metaphysical, I think that surely phenomenology is behind that approach. He says, for instance, that the goal is to achieve a positive and concrete view or intuition, because the German term is Anschauung of nature, Anschauung der Natur. Nevertheless, I believe that it is safe to say that the goal, the outcome of this kind of approach is not a dogmatic one. Because what this approach, which might seem to begin with a sort of strongly metaphysical approach, leads in the end, is what Strauss describes as zetetic skepticism, zetetic skepticism. What is zetetic skepticism? So zetetic skepticism, in Strauss's view, unlike radical skepticism, according to which even the simple problems, what Strauss refers to as fundamental and permanent problems, aren't available. It is ultimately the position of the already mentioned positivism and historicism. According to zetetic skepticism, and here the emphasis should be put on this adjective zetetic from zeteo, which means I search, I look for, but in order to find out. So according to zetetic skepticism, even though we cannot easily and obviously answer the questions, there is at least a chance to grasp, I would say, some permanent and fundamental problems. So precisely the ones rejected by radical skepticism. And here I believe that the emphasis should be put on permanent, because once again, this seems to lead us to ascertain that behind Strauss's perspective in this context, no matter how skeptical, there is a sort of residual, weak version of a metaphysical approach. This is at least what I claim in the book. And it seems to me that this is a presupposition in the end in order to make his attempt entirely meaningful. Now, the second question I mentioned previously, it was, the first was about the characteristics of genuine philosophizing. The second is how we can recover it. We have seen what genuine philosophizing means. How can we recover it? Well, here is where another important and recurrent concept in my book becomes key. And rather than a concept, it is a metaphor. It's the metaphor of the so-called second cave, or pit beneath the cave, or pit beneath the Platonic cave. So if the goal is that kind of weakly metaphysical approach, genuine philosophizing, well, in one way to recover could be to simply and sort of dogmatically reassert it. But this is not Strauss's strategy. His strategy in this concept, in this context, is more nuanced, so to say, more refined, I would say. And it has to do with the second case. What does it mean? Well, summarizing, we can say that the moderns, due to the encounter with ultimately revelation, and perhaps here the wells will start to raise an eyebrow. And in particular, with what in Revelation? The idea of God omnipotence and inscrutability, by means either of secularization, or which seems to be the Strauss's view, by means of polemics against a tradition based on revelation, but in a way that by polemics, modernity remains entrapped in that view based on omnipotence and inscrutability. The moderns no longer have precisely that concept of nature as a standard, as essence or idea, understood in that traditional sense. And so they no longer can philosophize in that original, genuine sense. So how can we recover that perspective according to Strauss? Well, here is where I believe an expression used by Carl Levitt in one of his letters I mentioned in this book turns out to be particularly useful in order for us to understand Strauss's strategy and procedure. Because Levitt says that Strauss wants ultimately to turn the systematic question, the philosophical question, into historical analysis. What does it mean? It means that, once again, rather than trying to rehabilitate that genuine, weakly, residually, if I may say so, metaphysical approach in a sort of asserting it directly, Strauss tries to show that behind the view, for instance, represented by historicism and the historical consciousness, there is precisely that view, ultimately based on revelation, which deprives philosophy from its foundation. But what's the implication? The implication is that by historical deconstruction, historische Destruktion, like in Heidegger, but with an opposite goal in mind, we can show that precisely that view, the historicist view, which claims to be the final word, the final view, according to which that kind of genuine philosophizing is a delusion, is naive, and cannot be recovered. But if we can show that, and this is Strauss's attempt as far as I understand, if we can show that everything depends, so to say, on the encounter of the philosophical tradition with the tradition ultimately, which can ultimately be traced to revelation and its view of God's omnipotence and inscrutability, we can make those presuppositions ineffective to some extent. So, by doing what? We can show that it's a sort of historical encounter, not a theoretical, philosophical problem. So in this sense, according to Levitt, Strauss turns the systematic question into historical analysis. And so once we recognize that the historicist view is the result of a view which is historical itself, we can claim that it is not the final word, that it is bound to be overcome or superseded, and we can rehabilitate, this is Strauss's understanding as far as I understand him, but of course I'm open to pushbacks and questions on that. So by showing this historicity itself, precisely of the historicist perspective, we can rehabilitate what? Well, according to Strauss, the Greek perspective, which, not accidentally, he describes as the natural perspective, natural philosophizing. So this is the meaning, I would say, of Lewis's description of Strauss's strategy as a strategy which aims to turn the systematic question into historical analysis. And let me know if I have some more time.
Yes.
Okay, so two points. The first point I would like to raise is that the view I've tried to sketch is to some extent, and I try to explain why I believe it is only to some extent, in contradiction with an attempt to justify philosophy on a purely Elenctic basis. What does it mean? So, rely on even statements by Strauss himself. It seems that philosophy can be justified by showing that revelation is impossible. This is what Strauss says more than once. And well, irrespective of whether this can be achieved, because this is another question. My point regarding this view is that a mere Elenctic justification of philosophy, if we do not address the problem of the presuppositions of the historicist perspective, so this idea that the encounter between philosophy and the tradition resting on revelation deprives philosophy of its basis, which is, once again, that concept of nature. If we do not address this second part too, the Elenctic justification of philosophy, at least this is my impression, doesn't suffice, because even if that justification, that refutation were possible, I believe that the presuppositions which are at the basis of the modern view would be unaddressed. They would remain as they are. And so we wouldn't have entirely, at least, the chance to re-enable that kind of genuine natural philosophizing Strauss apparently aims to recover. At least this is my understanding. So the only way to say that the Elenctic justification can suffice is to say that by rejecting revelation, once again, if this is possible, and in Strauss's view as well, it is normally debated and debatable. So the only way to claim that the Elenctic justification is sufficient is to claim that by rejecting revelation, as a sort of logical result, we will also reject the basis, the presuppositions. So the idea, ultimately, of God's omnipotence and inscrutability, which, according to Strauss, on this, I believe he's pretty clear, deprives philosophy of that view of nature as something stable, which philosophy needs to be truly genuine philosophy. And a final point I'd like to make has to do with, in particular, the discovery of exotericism in the late 1930s. Because if you read my book, you'll see that Strauss is more outspoken regarding the topics I've tried to introduce and summarize in the 30s and sometimes even in the late 20s. Let's say in the early 30s. And so one might believe, and I think that's absolutely acceptable and possible, that by discovering, or I would say by better emphasizing the role of philosophical exotericism, that kind of metaphysical, no matter how weak I describe, is abandoned after that turning point, because it amounts, it is not like the reorientation, if we look at Strauss, how Strauss describes his philosophical development. Still, it is indeed a very important moment, and I think it amounts to a turning point. So one could say that that perspective I've tried to describe is characteristic of the pre-exoteric Strauss, let's put it this way. Well, I'm not entirely convinced by this. Why I'm not? Because, first of all, there are references to the second cave, and of course, to what the second cave implies. After that period, there is, for instance, a reference, very clear one, in the 40s. There are references to the fundamental role of nature after that, let's say, phase or turning point. So I believe that no matter how Strauss readjusted his perception of the genuine philosophical approach, his discovery, let's put it this way, he calls it that way in his letter to Klein, of exotericism, doesn't impair my understanding. I mean, this is what I would say. And if you look at those letters, the letters where the discovery of exotericism unfolds, so to say, the letters Strauss wrote to Klein between 1938 and early 1939, you will see that there are some instances where Strauss seems to save from that kind of revolution, for instance, the Socratic dialectical approach. And there is one in particular where Strauss indicates, pinpoints as something characteristic of philosophy, the relation between, he says, anthropos, logos, and on. And as far as I understand, this is a way to say that there is a link, which is precisely the one needed by dialectics between humans, their discourses on the things, and reality being on. So it seems to me that even after the discovery of esotericism, one can still see the approach I've described as not only the genuinely philosophical and naturally philosophical approach according to Strauss, but his own philosophical approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Alberto. Questions?
Let me take this examination book in order to take notes. No, I'm not kidding you. It's an examination book.
Here, you start.
All right, so to start the examination. So, Alberto, if I understand you, natural philosophizing is largely about establishing the existence of nature and confronting challenge of revelation, challenge of historicism. I got two questions on that assumption. Is revelation for Strauss a subset of the view that, or just one form of the view that causality is not fundamental, or that there is no nature? In other words, that things might happen, pop out of nothing, so on and so forth, as Heidegger suggests. Is that the more fundamental view, revelation is just one form of that? Or do you mean to be suggesting revelation is the more fundamental phenomenon there? My second question is, what about another?
Let me answer once at a time. Because,
So first of all, you said that the goal is
establishing the existence of nature. I wouldn't say that. I think that nature is a presupposition.
A nature already existing
And stable to some extent is the presupposition of genuine philosophizing, according to Strauss. And the other part, well,
it seems that
the problem with the view based on revelation due to omnipotence, that's possibly the more important of the two attributes, the other being inscrutability, or do you say unscrutability? Inscrutability, I was right.
is that if you have on this,
I think Strauss is pretty clear. If you have an omnipotent God, nature as something transcending, even God, the reach of gods becomes an unavailable concept. So he makes the example of the Greek understanding based on Ananke and Moira as something beyond the gods themselves. So there is this sort of higher necessity. And this view is totally threatened, ultimately made unavailable and meaningless by the biblical view because of omnipotence.
So philosophy is impossible, right?
because so if philosophy needs another approach,
And the problem with modern philosophy is that, as I try to explain, by means either of direct secularization of some biblical views, or precisely in the attempt, Strauss says, by way of polemics. What does it mean? Philosophy, modern philosophy wanted to recover the Greek approach, but it was faced with the biblical understanding of nature. And so nature was no longer that kind of stable paradigm, and so tried to shield itself from that perspective. And by doing that, remained entrapped to some extent. And so no longer, and could no longer recover that idea of nature as a stable, permanent order, which at least performs the function of the goal of the theorem. That's the point. You do not have that. Everything becomes contingent to some extent.
Let me, can I insert something?
Of course.
It would seem that revelation requires a notion of nature and order in order for God to show his power through miracles, contrary to order. So how would you know it's a miracle if everything is disorderly?
yes,
But may I add one point on this?
Yeah,
So-
this is a Guelph point.
Okay.
is there a Ghibellini point too?
Yeah, no.
If so, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's it.
No, I wanted to emphasize that
Strauss is always very interested in those views, especially in this case medieval views, like Occam, according to which there is no difference ultimately from the regular course of nature and the miracle, because everything depends on God's will. Even the so-called, because it becomes so-called ordinary course of nature, because it can be changed. It is no longer something stable.
Mm-hmm.
And this is also a point which is raised regarding, for instance, not only regarding nature understood as physis, so to say, but also regarding what is regarded as by nature just and so on, because the point which is raised by that group of thinkers, medieval thinkers, is that even what is regarded as good, as just, can be changed. It depends on God's view, God's will. Otherwise, a different view would
amount to the negation of his omnipotence. That's the view.
Yes, I see.
And this is incompatible with philosophy understood in that Greek natural genuine sense, according to Strauss. At least this is what I understand.
Let's go to your second point.
Okay. So, well, are you suggesting then that revelation, so a challenge to the concept of nature, that I agree, nature is a presupposition of philosophy, as Strauss often says. So is your thought that to the concept of ananke, that wasn't a problem for Socrates? It's only a problem that arises in response to the biblical God?
No, I know that Strauss sometimes is trying to emphasize that a similar perspective can perhaps be found also in the Greek understanding, in particular in Socrates. I would say that it is clear that the strongest case for that kind of approach is the case based on revelation.
Sure,
So,
yeah.
I'm ready to admit that the perspective I've tried to describe is not something which can be proved beyond any doubt. And I also describe that as a tentative solution. So it is clear that Strauss wasn't like 100% sure, so to say. So it oftentimes it seems that that's an hypothesis, that's a solution he believes represent the only possible solution, and so he is presenting that as the only possible solution if we want to recover and still have philosophy as a meaningful attempt. But what I try to emphasize is that if we do not accept that view as Strauss's view in the end, and if we at the same time accept the fact that true philosophy, according to him, must be based on that Greek approach, rely on something stable, at least as an aim, we need to accept the view, which is, for instance, Stanley Rose's view, that philosophy itself, in the end, wasn't regarded as something entirely possible by Strauss, and so even understood as philosophical life, entirely meaningful life, and so that would amount to Strauss's noble lie in the end. So I believe that this is a way to put it.
Can I give you my second question real fast? This is...
How was your second?
Is there not another challenge to Socratic philosophy? Strauss mentions modern science right at the introduction to natural right and history, where modern science has, seems to have destroyed the teleological view of nature, and that seems that, in addition to being significant for natural right, it seems that, as he presents it, the Socratic view of human beings was bound up with a teleological view of nature, so that it comes to be hard to understand human beings with the triumph of at least modern physics in explaining the heavenly bodies.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm glad that you emphasize the fact, as I do in the book, that he says, seems to.
But he doesn't say that in the earlier version of the lectures.
Oh,
19.
okay. But in the published, most
He adds
authoritative
a bunch of reservations in the published one, which don't appear in the earlier
nonetheless, in the published version, he says.
It does seem to, yeah.
But in the book, I try to emphasize, for instance, one important feature of Strauss's view of modern science, which has to do with what we were saying. So he says that, for instance, in philosophy and law, very clearly, but also in religious situation of the present. He emphasizes the fact that modern science, natural science, is becomes idealistic, or he says phenomenalist, precisely in order to shield itself from revelation, from the idea of an omnipotent God. Because once again, that idea deprives philosophy and science from its basis, which is this goal of have this foundation, at least as an object, of having something stable. If you do not have that, the only solution becomes to become idealistic and phenomenalist. So yes, let's say that modern science is a huge problem from this perspective. The fact that modern science proves to work and to make a great technological development possible seems to be an indication that there is some truth in that. But Strauss, nonetheless, in order to entirely understand that phenomenon, and by means of a comparison with the Greek approach, emphasizes the fact that there is this, I would say, flight to some extent into a phenomenalist approach, precisely because of this new idea, which modern science encounters because of the Bible, because of the fact that in the meantime the Bible and what the Bible means, omnipotence, on, has entered the world of philosophy, Greek philosophy. This is another expression Strauss resorts to, has made that object problematic. And so the only way to save science as something servable, usable, meaningful is to find that way out of the problem. So yes, I mean, I'm ready to admit that science and the rejection of the old teleological approach is a problem. But Strauss is also trying to emphasize that the picture is more complex. And another thing that must be emphasized in this regard is that while describing the second sailing as Socrates' path, Strauss emphasizes that that doesn't amount precisely to embrace a teleological view against the materialistic view. It is a way to suspend the judgment in a skeptical manner from that perspective, and resort to the logoi rather than a description of nature in its materiality. Thank you.
Alison.
I want to ask a question now. She should go first.
I should go first? Well, I'm going to channel a little bit yesterday's panel on your book with Susan Shell and Nasser, Benegar, and Devin Stauffer, and because there were several questions that remain unanswered. And one that I think all three of them asked a version of is what exactly the second cave is, or the cave beneath the cave, and what makes it a natural cave, an unnatural cave, as opposed to the natural first cave. And so I'd like to specify the question: at what point does the cave beneath the cave become a fully fledged unnatural cave? Because as Devin mentioned, there's four ingredients that go into the second cave for it to somehow form. The first one is the Bible, and you've only talked about the Bible. The second one is the scholastic tradition of the fusion of, this tradition of obedience with the tradition of philosophy that Strauss calls absurd. Then there's the early modern revolt, and then there is fully fledged historicism, academic historicism. And I really don't quite understand at what point is the second cave a second cave, at what point, and becomes kind of closed, because it seems like even in the second cave, even in modernity, there are still people that can get out of it. Obviously, you showed the way how Strauss gets out of it, or who are interested in the truth. Nietzsche would be one person who's still
trying to get out.
Yeah. So, but yes, please talk a little bit about the natural cave, what makes that natural, and at what point the second cave becomes a fully fledged second cave, and when it's maybe a half second cave or a little.
Does everybody know about Plato's cave? Which is an image made in Plato's Republic at the beginning of Book 7 to illustrate the life of man. We all live in a natural cave, sort of strapped down with our eyes on at the end of a dark end of the cave, on which images are being projected by people behind us, legislators who give us things to believe, or shadows, yes. So that's the first cave, and then Strauss came along with the idea that there's a second cave. So what is that?
Unnatural.
That's okay.
So he
How does that,
describes
and that
these two.
prevents you, being in the second cave prevents you from getting to the first. From the first, there's an escape route, the light in the back of you, if only you could see it, which is natural philosophizing. Right? So,
I think so.
so you're right. So now the second cave prevents you from.
You have first to
Escaping the first
climb
cave.
up
Yeah.
to the first in order to start again to philosophize.
Yes.
Because their philosophizing is an available possibility. In the second, it is meaningless. It is impossible in the end. So, but to try to answer Anna's question or questions, and I recall that David Stoffer yesterday made the same point. And I didn't have any time to answer that very important question. So I'll try to begin to answer that question today. So first of all, what makes the first cave natural and the second unnatural? First of all, I would say Strauss himself, because he describes these two caves in that way. He says the first, the Platonic, is the natural, and the second is unnatural. Okay, so this is what. So why does he resort to these two connotations? Well, I believe that an element is the starting point of any attempt to philosophize. In the first, the starting point is, in the German, please, Anna, correct me if I'm wrong, Schein und Meinung. So appearance and opinion. That's the element characteristic of the first Platonic natural cave. And we have seen that the second sailing, so the turn to the logoi, the discourses, the opinions about the things, is key, as far as I understand, in this attempt by Strauss to recover natural genuine philosophizing. So there you have this element, opinions. In the second cave you have prejudices, Vorurteilen.
Vorurteile.
Vorurteilen. Danke. And so what's the difference? Well, this is a term Strauss for Urteilen. Prejudices is a term Strauss resorts to more than once, not always in this specific sense, but in this context, he says, already in Spinoza's Critique of Religion, that a characteristic of prejudice, as distinct from Meinung, opinion, is precisely it's being based on revelation. Now, what does it mean? That's key to me. Because it might be claimed that what is key in that view is the dependence of an authoritative source. So the simple fact, which is not simple in itself, but that God is regarded as having said that. And so everything introduced in this way becomes much more than a simple opinion one can debate about. But I believe, and I try to show this in my book, that this is only part of Strauss's view. Because it seems to me that when Strauss, and particularly in a religious situation of the present and the intellectual situation of the present, both from the early 30s, 30 and 32 respectively.
These are, excuse me, these are letters that he wrote.
Lectures. And
I was just trying to point out the relevance of German. Because these are expressions that he used in German for Urteilen, which is prejudice, versus Meinung, which is opinion.
Unschein,
Yeah,
appearance.
Unschein. All right.
Okay. So, while emphasizing that already a major problem in prejudice is understood in that way is the fact that they are based ultimately on what God said, revelation. He also emphasizes the fact that at the basis of, by giving some examples, nature precisely, he seems to emphasize the content of those prejudices. And when he does so, he makes reference very clearly precisely to nature in one case, another one is natural right. And so I believe that at the center of his interest there is precisely the effect of omnipotence on the concept of nature, and the fact that that concept gets destabilized. So it is not only the source, it is also the content, and the content, not accidentally, this is my understanding, has to do, the one Strauss is specifically interested in, has to do with nature. Natural right, or nature as the object of, subject object, I'm also a bit confused, of physics, okay? So, I think it is this element, the difference between the presence of simple opinions or prejudices understood in this sense that, according to Strauss, makes the first case natural, the second unnatural. Another source, I believe, of his choice of...
Excuse me, so modern science is a second cave.
To some extent, I believe...
Because it doesn't understand nature in a teleological sense.
Not, well, if not entirely teleologically, as something available for contemplation.
Mm-hmm. Right.
The thinking itself and so on.
Right.
That becomes a problem beyond the human grasp. Mm-hmm. Modern science becomes a phenomenalist in that. But I was going to say one thing. Oh, okay, regarding why the first cave, the Platonic cave, is described as natural. Another important source I mention in the book is phenomenology. Particularly, I would say in this case, Husserl. His concept of natürliche Einstellung and the idea that there are certain views, opinions that belong to a natural world human beings live in, which is different from the understanding of the word characteristic of science, meaning modern science. So Husserl already describes that kind of stance as natural, that kind of world, pre-scientific world as natural. The element of that world is, once again, what people normally believe regarding things in a very commonsensical way. And so the idea that that kind of world is already a natural one, and the same element of that world is the one that is found in the Platonic cave in the end, appearance and opinion. So the idea that that kind of word is a natural one can be found already in Husserl. And Strauss was surely influenced by phenomenology. This is something that should be emphasized more. I think that his view is an original one in the end, but it is important to realize that he didn't start to philosophize, so to say, out of the blue and trying to go back to the ancient philosophy. He received his training in the 20s in not only neo-Kantian in a neo-Kantian environment, but also in particular in a phenomenological environment. He worked with Husserl. He was largely influenced by Heidegger. We have seen an instance of that, his idea of using historische Destruktion, Heideggerian, I say deconstruction, one may also say distraction, but the term is to reduce to a picture, a concept to its basic elements, and in order to not decompose, I cannot find the right term, to deconstruct. Deconstruct.
Everybody says deconstruct.
Exactly. So in that I also see an explanation why he resorted to this idea of the natural cave. And the final point is that the source of this distinction is Maimonides in the end, because, and I emphasize this in especially in the last chapter, it is Maimonides who says that to the typical difficulties of philosophizing, what we can describe as natural philosophizing, we today have an additional, either artificial or historical, he also, depending on the context, this is Strauss speaking, difficulty, and it is Maimonides, and Strauss limits himself to quoting him, that traces this additional historical or artificial difficulty for philosophizing to the Bible itself. Meaning, I believe Strauss understands omnipotence.
Can I just see if I'm understanding you?
Sorry, just one more point, but only one. Regarding the question whether the entrapment in the second cave begins only with historicism, or Strauss in intellectual situation of the present, if I do not remember wrongly, but I'm pretty sure, describes the second cave as the cave of modernity, not just the cave of historicism. He explains that the quoting Maimonides, that entrapment to some extent began already at that time. What is key to understand to me is that the fact that the Bible is there becomes a problem only for philosophy. So that's the point. The problem is when philosophy remains entrapped in that view. The Bible can do what it wishes, so to say. The problem is when there is this encounter, because the encounter between philosophy, which is Greek philosophy, that's the only genuine philosophy, with the biblical view, makes philosophy impossible. And so that's a problem only for philosophy, not in general.
The entanglement makes philosophy impossible, not the encounter.
So,
well, of course.
So the second cave begins before modern science.
Before modernity.
Well, possibly in the Middle Ages, depending. Anna has brought an important point. That's not a problem with Maimonides because they were able to understand it, but the problem begins when the philosophical approach starts to remain entangled in that. And so gets some of the views, either by secularization or by polemics, into the philosophical approach.
Oh, we've got a bunch of questions.
If I could just make sure I'm understanding. So the theme in Strauss's writing of reason and revelation, or reason versus revelation, would be a theme that's unique to the second cave for us. It would come for us as a question first in time to get us to the original cave, and as the question that's first in importance about the natural things.
Well, it depends. So I understand that you mean the challenge represented by revelation.
Yes.
That's
And the theme in Strauss's writing of reason and revelation, that's a recurring major theme. But that theme, that concern in his work, would be a concern that we should understand as specific to the second cave. And that we have to think our way through that to get to the first cave to ask.
Perhaps not entirely in that. The second cave is the result of that entrapment. Verstrickung is the term, German term. So the idea that some elements of the biblical view are retained by philosophy itself, okay? And so start to characterize the philosophical approach. So that's the second cave. But of course, the fact that there is a revelation out there is a fact, and philosophy has to address that fact to some extent. But I believe that the real problem for philosophy is precisely, so the reason why revelation is so important and revelation, I believe that here means biblical revelation, is so challenging, is precisely because of that idea of omnipotence and inscrutability, which makes the foundation of philosophy, nature, understood in that sense, a problematic, highly problematic concept, ultimately untenable. Otherwise, it wouldn't be so challenging, so to say. If we still stick to a Greek approach where you have this kind of necessity, moira, ananke, above the gods, well, I think that there is no issue, philosophically speaking. I hope I have answered your question.
Manuel Lopez.
Thanks, Harvey. Thanks for the talk, Alberto. I'm just going on a simple thing that I wanted to clarify in my mind. You said that the Socratic Elenctic is not sufficient, or but by that, do you mean, I wasn't sure whether by not sufficient you meant not sufficient rhetorically or not sufficient in terms of moving opinion or giving a sufficient space for philosophy to be born in the minds of the young, or you meant not sufficient, really not sufficient, meaning that Socrates was mistaken if he thought that he had, let's say, had refuted revelation, refuted it, at least refuted in the sense that the cause for the attachment to revelation was a confusion in the minds of his interlocutors about justice and not understanding their hopes about morality and so forth. That he was mistaken about that because something was going to happen that Socrates couldn't have understood, which was this new thing, the biblical revelation, which was so entirely unlike paganism, because as you say in Homer, there's necessity and morality, and then so in that sense, then if you're saying that, then you're saying what Strauss is saying, that historicism was essentially correct. because despite the comments Strauss makes about what can be achieved through unaided human reason, that was obviously incorrect in the case of Socrates, that we had to wait for the Bible, the biblical revelation to spread and to enter the hearts and minds of men to realize that that was insufficient, that I was just not clear when you said that it's not sufficient, what you meant.
I believe I will not answer your question completely, but let me just try to explain better what I was what I wanted to say when I referred to Elenkos, but I said Elenctic justification of philosophy.
Yes.
Philosophy as something which is not enough. So let me try to clarify that, and then perhaps we can move on from there. So my point is that if what I've tried to explain regarding genuine philosophizing, the fact that it requires that kind of nature as at least a possible aim and objective and so on is correct, a simple Elenctic justification of philosophy in itself, so a refutation,
Yes.
Assuming it is possible for a moment, it wouldn't in itself re-establish that foundation. So the idea of nature understood in that sense. Unless we already argue historically, as Strauss tries to do, so unless we already turn the systematic question into historical analysis by means of deconstruction, to quote once again Levitt, and if we do so, the refutation of revelation brings with itself, yes, in this case, the rehabilitation of that concept of nature, but only if we are ready to argue in that perspective, in that deconstructive perspective. That's my point. I hope I've explained this a little bit better. If we just say, okay, let's try to refute revelation, full stop, and we do not address the question which is behind revelation, the presuppositions, and we leave the problem of the presuppositions of modern philosophy unaddressed, I believe that that kind of Elenctic justification, assuming it is possible, wouldn't suffice. So we have to entirely see that the problem is a little bit broader, more complex. There is also that part.
Yep.
Does it make sense? But perhaps there was
that makes sense. Just in my experience, I didn't want it. Just sometimes Strauss talks about it. It's if he's applying the Elencus, the personal Elencus of Socrates to the whole historical thing. So, for instance, sometimes when he talks about the effect revelation had and making philosophy more difficult to biblical revelation, he will say that it's because it engendered hopes, right? That the biblical revelation engendered such extreme hopes, and that when those hopes were disappointed, there had to be this a psychological move, so to speak, on the part of modern philosophers that they hid, as you say, they somehow indirectly protected the hope while attacking.
Yeah, sure.
Was you right? But but that sounds so similar. So you're saying that kind of psychological thing that Strauss does sounds so similar to me, to what occurs in Socratic dialogues on a one-on-one. That the analysis, subterranean analysis of the person he's speaking to, and in terms of the moral hopes, right? So that's one thing, and so the question was really, you're saying that Strauss for himself, maybe that was insufficient without a different kind of analysis, and that is why I wasn't sure. But your answer helped a lot. But it was just, I think of these two approaches, right? Socrates is alive today, personal cross-examination of Heidegger, Nietzsche, and something is one thing, versus a different kind.
Let me ask his question in my way. So, you've got Plato's Apology, and Socrates is in a cave because he is accused of not holding to the city's religion, and he can't get out of that completely. He has to pretend that he believes in the Delphic oracle or some daimonion or something. In other words, so that's an illustration of the first cave, right? Now, what is different about the second cave?
So as far as rhetoric is concerned, well,
It's, or either rhetoric, or the truth.
I'm not sure that I understand the question completely, but
Yeah.
so let me say two things. First, regarding the dialectics, especially after this rediscovery or discovery of ancient exotericism, that term dialectics comes to mean also a sort of twist, a rhetorical approach, and that might be the one represented by the trial and the defense in front of the city and so on. The relationship between the city and philosophy becomes more and more important, and there is a growing and increasing emphasis on the tension between the two. But I believe that the other part, so the philosophical parts, entirely philosophical part, still remains. So dialectics is still understood as a way to contemplate the sun, or at least try to contemplate the sun. And another point I wanted to make has to do with the hopes which are disappointed. Because while you were mentioning this, I was thinking of this particularly chapter 5, if I'm not mistaken, in my book, which is about that in particular. So it is entitled Strauss and the Politicization of Philosophy. In possibly a lecture which has been published and edited by Svetozar Minkov recently, The Origin of Modern Political Thought, Strauss explains the politicization of philosophy, so the fact that philosophy no longer is an entirely theoretical form of life, but becomes a tool, a weapon, Strauss even says, in order to change politics and the political sphere, precisely because of the disappointed hope. And that's a typical instance of the entrapment of modernity in the biblical view, because the fact that Strauss says that the reason why modern philosophy starts to understand itself as intrinsically practice-oriented rather than a theoretical approach is precisely the fact that humans had been accustomed to the idea of being protected by God and its providence, and so this disappointed hope in providence turns philosophy into something practice-oriented and intrinsically political. But I also emphasize the fact that, to me, in order to keep coherence with the part we mentioned earlier, another important point is that philosophy, precisely because of the entrapment in the biblical view, no longer has what makes the entirely theoretical approach meaningful. So in order for theorein to be possible, you need to have an object which can be contemplated. If you no longer have that object, Why should you contemplate something? That becomes a delusion.
Allison's.
This is such a great conversation, and thank you so much for your talk. I was trained as a mathematician, and at first, so when I was listening to you discussing what genuine philosophizing is for Strauss, I couldn't help but notice that it sounds like the ambitions of pure mathematics, right? So we know that through Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorems, he demonstrated that it's impossible to prove the consistency of a system without some reference outside the system, right? And that's the bridge to modern computer science. I'm wondering to what extent, I'm just listening to the talk about revelation, it reminds me so much of Silicon Valley with their talk about artificial intelligence and the singularity and so forth. To what extent is that the new revelation? And what might Strauss might have to say about that? The reason I'm asking is, I don't know if you noticed this, but the 2 Nobel Prizes in physics and chemistry this year went to computer scientists. So in some sense, we are putting our faith in these machines that generate predictions that seem to work, but we have no idea about the why inside it. To me, that sounds like the death of philosophy. Just curious, the death of philosophizing, really.
The death.
Yes. So.
Or a phenomenalist approach. It reminds me of a phenomenalist approach, an approach according to which you cannot grasp the truth, the final truth. But I think I'm not able to give you a good answer to your question because it goes much beyond.
Okay.
But what I can say regarding pure mathematics, for instance, I think that it plays a role in Strauss's perspective. Once again, the source of that can be, might be Husserl and phenomenology. What seems to me possible to maintain is that, according to Strauss, and I say that because he says that a couple of times, clearly enough, and perhaps it has to do with the first part of your question, some knowledge becomes possible if there is already some rationality in what we want to know that enables that attempt to know. And he said, for instance, he says explicitly that an Epimethian approach to nature, so an approach according to which there is no foresight, there is no rationality behind the cosmos, behind what we want to understand, makes ultimately knowledge understood in that strong sense impossible. But to me, it seems to me that that strong meaning of knowledge, which becomes impossible without some foresight, is, even though in a very weak sense, a residual sense, still behind Strauss's understanding of philosophy. And that idea that at least we can grasp some permanent problems. So mathematics is surely there. It is not removed. What Strauss would say nowadays about Silicon Valley and artificial intelligence, perhaps, is a question I give to Harvey. I'm sure he will be able to answer this question better than I can, if you wish, Harvey. Otherwise, I leave it at here.
Because he wrote about Darwin, didn't he?
Strauss?
Yeah. Didn't he write about Darwin?
I can't think of a single citation.
Because that's an interesting thing too, because their nature is not something that's fixed, but it's something that's in motion, right, perpetually.
Darwin spoke of species which are fixed.
So,
Yeah, maybe,
They're not fixed
yeah.
for a time.
Equilibria. So stopping point. It doesn't. Why does it stop? What makes it?
What makes evolution stop?
regarding this, one thing
Yeah.
that I can tell you is that, at least in one instance, he says that philosophy presupposes the eternity of the whole, but not necessarily of the visible whole, but according to the Aristotelian understanding, but at least of, he says, of the cosmos or a chaos, but in any event, you need to have something stable, otherwise philosophy is meaningless. So this, perhaps this may have something to do with the Darwinian approach and the evolution. In the end, you need something stable behind that. Even if you do not have, if everything becomes a process, a never-ending process, a never-ending development, you cannot have philosophy understood in that sense. You can have philosophy as some historicism understood it, as a self-understanding of a given epoch, of a given culture, historically conditioned and so on, but not that genuine philosophical attempt to grasp something permanent.
Or put it otherwise, change always presupposes something changeless.
Yes, exactly.
Because change has to happen to something. You say American history means America isn't what today what it began as, but you're still using that same word America.
So that's the human, maybe. Philosophy ends when machines surpass humans.
In the 1962 Natural Right course, I believe, he talks about someone, an early AI person, I think it's a well-known early AI person, I forget the name, who said, well, someday they might get smarter than we are and be in charge. And Strauss quotes this and he says, well, if this is true, we should get rid of them, right away.
Really? Where does he say that? That's interesting.
It's in 1962 course. Anyone else know the reference to Natural Right course?
He was a degrowther then, Strauss.
He was a Luddite.
Dan,
That's a question.
I'm not sure if this is a question, so I'm hesitant to ask, but it's very interesting, this idea of, I've always loved this idea of the permanent questions. But listening to you talk about it today, I find myself wondering, is that a possible, I'm curious about this Zetetic skepticism, is it really a possible view? Because if I can really know that the questions are permanent, do I still have a question? Or have I, in some way, an answer? It's one thing to teach a great books course and say, children, these books raise fundamental questions we haven't answered, and we should still look at them. And maybe I can recover an openness to doing that. But it would be yet another thing to say I somehow have access to a truth that there are certain permanent questions that will not receive, to which we will not have an answer, because there's something about these questions is that they're permanent. I'm trying to understand what it means to know that.
So at least, as far as I understand, it means that there are questions, problems, characterizing humans, qua humans, transhistorically. So even though we cannot give an answer, we can still say and claim that these are permanent. And so we have to say that we need to grasp human nature in this case. Otherwise, we can say that it is perhaps fundamental, but not permanent. But this fundamental character becomes relative. So I can say, to me, not today, this is fundamental. Maybe tomorrow, another thing will be fundamental for you and for us in a different time. But if we say this is permanent, that's a statement. This is what I understand. You cannot say that it is permanent unless you already argue from that sort of metaphysical. And then this perspective, this metaphysical perspective, once again, it is reduced to a very minimum. Because what Strauss says is that philosophy in the end amounts to a form of skepticism. But there is the Zetetic part, and which enables the idea that there are permanent problems. So there must be, Berlin says, oh, Strauss claimed to have achieved or to be inspired by a metaphysical eye. Well, that was clearly too much because his view was a skeptical one. But like in a very remote corner of Strauss's room, a very tiny metaphysical eye must be there. Otherwise, this is my understanding, one cannot speak of permanent problems, characterizing human beings qua human beings. He says that to Levitt in his letters. I mentioned this in the introduction. And he emphasizes that Levitt, precisely because he get rid of that very tiny and remote metaphysical eye, becomes unable to justify philosophy in the end. And it is, well, that's Kruger, another philosopher with whom Strauss had a great exchange. Kruger says, you are not clueless like Levitt because you resort to the second sailing. And Strauss, in a private conversation, doesn't say anything against that. This doesn't mean that he accepted that, but if we consider this against the background I've tried to describe, I think it amounts to an important point.
May I try one more follow-up? Of course. I think I understand why the danger in not having this permanence, that little shred of permanence. But I'm thinking of, and maybe this is misguided of me, I'm thinking of sort of like Kantian antinomies. If the permanence to which you have access is the permanence of an insolubility, then that could have also disastrous consequences for philosophy. Because if you know that this is in fact an insoluble question, it's a permanent problem, then one has to face the fact that you said, so there's nothing to do here now. And if I know that, then I don't know if I can continue to ask the questions that lead to the fundamental problem.
That's a very good point. That's a very good point. Still, we would have moved a step further from a totally relativistic and historicist approach. It is very little, I understand. I agree with you, if this is Strauss's final position. But still we would be able to grasp a permanent problem. Isn't that already something?
I just wonder if it seems that it's that Kantian issue that leads directly to the relativist, the historicist approach, I think, somehow. But yeah, I don't know.
But you could also say permanent problems are the ones that are exposed in Plato's Republic, say. So there's also permanent practical problems, and those have to be, people have to understand them in every generation. I think what you're saying is if there's permanent theoretical problems, basically they're not even problems because they're just insolubilities. But you could say, so the challenge of revelation is a permanent theoretical challenge that can't be met, or does it, in asking, do you unfold every time anew, what you can actually know?
Yeah, I guess in saying, in order for there to be a question, don't you have to potentially there could be an answer, and it's not.
Right.
You don't know that it's a permanent problem. You have to a bit hope that there is a tomorrow somehow. Even though I agree, if you think there's only tomorrow after tomorrow, then again the question disappears.
You might have a reason for thinking that there's no practical solution. Politically, there will always be Democrats and Republicans.
Yeah.
Does that mean that we should forget about trying to decide which is better? No, but it does mean that there's reason to suppose that people will always overshoot the mark and become too Republican or too Democrat, and therefore give opportunity to the other side to make its mistake. All right. Alberto, this has been wonderful. Congratulations on this line of work.